Hello, everyone. My name is Sal. I'm the Accessibility Commissioner for SMU. I use they, them, and he, him pronouns, and today I'm going to run a little workshop about how to organize and run an accessible event. Specifically in the McGill context, but these skills can definitely be used more broadly. So anyone who's in a SMU service, who works for SMU, who is within the McGill sphere, can definitely use this information and hopefully create more accessible events. Okay, first of all, I'm going to share my screen. Awesome. So, as I said, this is the Accessible Event Planning Workshop in the McGill context by me, Sal Cuthbertson, the Accessibility Commissioner for SMU. So the sections of our presentation today are pretty simple. I decided to organize it according to kind of the plan that you would be running an event in. So I'm starting with like what to do before an event, including like knowing your attendees, accessibility for the venue, thinking about speeches and presentations that may be made at your event, possible food and drink that's being served, and then volunteers, staffing, and important resources that you can contact. This is a McGill specific like resource list, but again, useful just to think about what these resources represent and how those could be applied to other contexts. And then also informing your attendees of these kind of accommodations. I also made a little list of things to do during the event. Often during these kind of events, once it starts, it just kind of goes and you kind of got to figure out from there what it's going to look like and deal with issues as they come about. So it's harder to give you concrete information, but I have supplied some in the form of a check-in in terms of knowing how your staff are doing, how your attendees are doing, etc. The third section of this presentation is going to be about after the event, making events more accessible through feedback mechanisms and through institutional memory. And the fourth section of this event, which doesn't follow this chronological order, but I still think is relevant, is asking about how we should run online events and things to consider when running an event online. As obviously this has relevance right now and probably in the future as well, in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and running events in an accessible way through online formats. Awesome. So section 1 of this presentation is about things that happen or should be prepared for before an event begins. Number 1 is to know your attendees. So this is important because you should think about who is attending your event, who's going to be there. This could be students, this could be professors, community members, etc. And there's kind of going to be some separate accommodations that need to be made depending on who these people are. For example, if you're talking about students, can you have a student rate for attendance versus professors if this is a mixed event? Are you charging more or less for community members or for students to think about who you want to be attending the event and who is kind of prioritized at the event? This obviously is going to change depending on what you're running, but it's just important to have that conversation or at least think about that process of who's going to be attending. In essence, the best way to get to know your attendees and what they need from you is to ask. So I really recommend that you provide attendees for your event with a form that might allow them to give you information about kind of what they need from you. This can be done through a variety of survey platforms, for example, Google Forms, Alchemer, Qualtrics, etc. There's a wide range of survey platforms you can use. I know that Google Forms is likely the most common platform that people use, but one thing to note when using Google Forms is that you should turn off the collect emails setting, as obviously it's important that this is an anonymous survey platform for individuals to supply you with accommodation needs. So you should specifically state that in your form that like, this is anonymous, please let us know any accommodations that you need, etc. I'd already mentioned a few, but things that you could ask your attendees in these forms, including like, what accessibility needs do you have? How can these accessibility needs best be met? And then if you would like a meeting to further discuss the accommodations that you need. And then optionally, the individual could supply you with their contact information if they wanted to have a follow-up with you about like more information about what they might need from you to attend an event and feel accommodated at said event. So just a good way to get to know your attendees. The second part of things you should be doing before an event is considering the accessibility of your venue. So before booking a venue, it's really important to see if you can do a walkthrough of the location, if this is a physical location, or in the very least, if you could do a floor plan review. Any larger scale events that you're running will likely have floor plans and will be accommodating to a walkthrough. I know SMU can be accommodating to those walkthroughs as well. You're able to contact the individual that you booked the room with, and you could think about walking through that area and understanding what the floor plan or area looks like. Things to consider in terms of your venue accessibility include physical accessibility, like parking, especially like wheelchair accessible parking, bathrooms, specifically in this context, like wheelchair accessible bathrooms, and there's a range of bathroom like services that can like allow an individual to utilize those services as they need. You should think about things like seating. Are people going to be adequately spaced out? Are people going to be given enough space in terms of seating? Are they all facing the front so they don't constantly need to be turning? These kind of things. Elevators are extremely important, again, for physical accessibility to assure that an individual in a wheelchair, on crutches, or otherwise like unable to utilize stairs is able to get to your event. And then also doors and entrances, things like entrance buttons, things like braille, things like wide doors, all should really be considered when you're hosting an event to assure that you're hosting an event that is physically accessible. Another thing to consider when looking at venue accessibility is inclusive design. This includes things like gender inclusive washrooms and clear posters and signage so that people won't get confused when entering the building to know where they need to go and know like what bathroom they can best use depending on their needs. The next thing to consider before doing an event, things you consider before you host said event, this obviously doesn't apply to everyone, but if you're making any speeches or any presentations, it's really important to release that information to attendees as early as possible and further consider the design and accommodations you're going to need to have those speeches or presentations run. The first thing you need to consider if you're putting things up on a screen or a projector is the design elements. So assuring that you have a accessible graphic design guide that you're following. I've linked one here and I can share these slides as well so you have access to that resource. But basically designing material that's going to be used for a presentation should consider things like contrasting colors, legible fonts, no flashing lights or flashing videos. All of those things obviously take away from the accessibility of a presentation. In terms of categories of fonts, I have my mouse here. I'm not sure if you can see it, but in the lower right corner, I have a few examples. Essentially, categories of fonts are display fonts and text fonts. Display fonts are like these first two here, Rosewood, Ziggurat. They're like big and flashy and kind of often colorful, and they actually can be quite difficult to read, especially if they're in cursive, and they can be quite difficult for screen readers to read or for individuals who are unable to see from like close distances to read. Whereas text fonts, as I have below here, such as Gotham, are like clearly spaced out words. They're very like easy to understand and easy to see each word. They're larger fonts, etc. And all these things should add to the accessibility of a presentation. And then I also have an example here of contrasting colors. So we need to consider things like red-green color blindness when designing things and ensure that the background of versus foreground of an image or poster that you're putting up is significant in terms of contrast. Another thing to consider is sensory accommodations. This can be such a long list of different accommodations that you might need to provide depending on the type of presentation or type of speech that is being done at the event. Things to consider in terms of broad strokes would be like image descriptions for presentations, captioning for any videos, microphones to allow both speakers to not have to overstrain themselves, but also individuals allowing them to hear what is being said. Possibly ASL interpretation, that would be American Sign Language interpretation. That would be dependent on if you had received an individual asking for an accommodation as related to hearing impairment. And then also alternate formats for material that's being spread, including Braille, things that are digital, things that are easy to read, large print. These should all be made accessible just generally, but also on request. And then consider things like sensory-free rooms, like a room that has a speech and a presentation going in it, especially if there's low lighting, can be quite overwhelming. And you might want to have spaces that are kind of chill spaces to an individual can remove themselves from a speech or presentation space to like chill out for a bit if they need. But one of the most important things regarding speeches and presentations is releasing that information to attendees as soon as possible, as individuals might want to adjust that material, read over it beforehand to get a better understanding of what's going to be presented. They might want to like have their screen reader be able to read over at the same pace that it is being presented. So informing people early is really what's important. And that's an important part of speeches and presentations if those are going on in your event. Next is food and drinks. Obviously, not always are you going to have food and drink being served at an event, but if you are, there are some really important accommodations to consider, including dietary restrictions. Some examples that I have here is that you should always provide water free of charge. We want to make sure people are hydrated. We love to see it. Non-alcoholic options besides water should also be provided if alcohol is being served at your event. You should consider things like vegetarian and vegan options, gluten-free options, halal, kosher, nut-free. Often for some of these requirements, there'll be individuals who supply you with that information that they need a halal or kosher option through your accessibility form, but you should still be inclusive even if you've not received a specific accommodation request for individuals who eat a wide variety of foods. This is especially relevant in the alcohol context, as obviously we do not want to promote only drinking alcohol, and we want to give options for individuals to choose non-alcoholic options. Furthermore, as regarding to alcohol being served at events, this should be done all the time, but it's just especially relevant in this context, is that cups should be opaque. Opaque meaning you cannot see through them. This is really important to just assure that people are not being asked questions about, what are you drinking? Is that water? Is that fizzy? Like, is that alcohol? Like, essentially, it's just a mechanism through which people can feel pressured to drink, and we don't want to support that. So opaque cups really helps. The classic is red Solo cups. Like, it doesn't need to be expensive to have a cup be opaque. It still does the same job. And if you're serving alcohol events, you should have servers that are trained professionals, or in the very least, you should have your servers server trained by Campus Life and Engagement. These server trainings run like very regularly, especially in the regular year. But basically anyone who is at McGill events serving alcohol usually has received this training, and includes things like knowing when to cut someone off, understanding like what alcohol is what percentage and what like might be considered too much, and like understanding things like designated drivers. And we just want to ensure that everyone has that training, so it should be considered when hosting an alcohol serving event. Next up is to consider your volunteers and staffers. So you really need to make sure that before an event occurs, you have enough volunteers or staffers to keep instructions in the space very clear. You should have someone like greeting individuals right at the door. You should have someone who knows things like wheelchair accessible avenues from the door, so that you can have someone like accompany an individual who might need those accommodations to the space. It's also really important to have someone doing things like serving water, someone else at like a registration table, so that it's very like clear in terms of the pathway that people need to take from the door of whatever venue you're at to the main space and the event. So that should all be considered and like planned out prior to your event being hosted. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of confusion, not only in your volunteers and staff, but also in your attendees. It's also really important that volunteers or staff get a chance to be orientated in the space before an event occurs. This is just for like their peace of mind, but also for your own organization. So this can be done by having attendees arrive like at a certain time, and then having volunteers and staff arriving earlier. But you can also, if you have time leading up to it, have volunteers and staff attend an orientation in the space to get them like acquainted with what the space looks like. You also need to be sure that you collect accessibility information from your volunteers and staff. The accessibility form that I mentioned at the start is not just for attendees, but you should also be supplying that to staffers to assure that they feel accommodated in the space and that they feel ready to run the event. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem in terms of keeping the event running smoothly. I also have a list here of resources to contact. This is McGill specific, but some of these resources can still be called by students anywhere. For example, the SMU WalkSafe. Most people might know what this is, but essentially this is a service that recruits volunteers to allow students to safely be walked from events to home. They can be booked for events, and like you can have them kind of sitting in the main area of your event, but they can also be called at any time to go to an event to walk someone home. I want to note that they're not currently operating due to COVID, but this is still a useful resource to use and to think about using when hosting a larger event, especially one that might contain alcohol or go later into the evening. Another option is SMOO Drive Safe. These are patrols that drive students home safely to and from anywhere on the island of Montreal for free. Often they run on weekend nights, but they can get quite busy. So it is important to consider this not being your only option in terms of accommodation for driving people home. You should have some kind of a budget if you're hosting late at night and if you're hosting an event with alcohol. There should be a budget like somewhat towards like Ubers and things like that. But this is still something that you can consider and be sure to spread knowledge of to your volunteers and staffers regarding an option for individuals who might need to drive home for whatever reason. A third contact or resource to consider is the Red Frogs. They're not actually specific to McGill, they're not a SMOO service, but they do provide positive peer presence in alcohol-fueled environments. I've seen them at events do things like providing water, handing out snacks. They do some kind of forms of peer support as well. They can also be ordered to attend an event. You don't need to like have, and then one person usually just shows up and like provides that service. So they're really, really useful, especially obviously alcohol fueled events. Those you should consider them. Just something to point out. The next part, as I've kind of talked about this a little bit through the presentation so far, but I want to make it clear, is that before you are hosting an event, you should always be informing your attendees. So it's important prior to make sure the attendees know all the information that you can provide to them about what the event is going to entail. This includes, as I mentioned before, all presentation information, a wheelchair access plan, if there is a presence of a gender neutral washroom and where it is so people can know, or if not in the like direct vicinity, where is the nearest gender neutral washroom? So it's not something to consider during your walkthrough. You should also do things like letting them know parking accessibility, letting them know the schedule for the event, and letting them know resources that are present so they can feel comfortable attending the event and knowing that they, for example, have a way home or have peer support or have people they can talk to if they don't want to drink alcohol. Like all of these kind of things are important just to make sure an attendee is in the right state of mind when attending an event and feels accommodative for it in terms of how you are hosting. Okay, next up, section 2 is during the event. As far as I've noticed is honestly, the majority of the work goes on before the event. Once the event starts, like you're running around, you're busy for sure, and like problems are gonna come up, but they're all very specific to the event context that you're in. And it's more about being accessible, being open, and like opening the channels of communication. So we'll talk about it. So as I mentioned here, like the main thing that I put in as what to do during an event is to check in. Throughout the event, you want to be checking in with attendees. You want to be checking in with staff and volunteers who are in different locations, checking in with the resources that are present. For example, if Walk Safe or Drive Safe are there. I really recommend, if you are able at least, to take notes, especially if people come to you with accessibility concerns during the event, or if something comes up that you realize you did not account for as related to accessibility. You'd really be surprised with the excitement of an event how much you can forget. I've hosted some big events and like writing up an exit report afterwards where I'm describing it, I'm like, oh, I don't actually remember nearly as much of this event as I thought that I would. Or the things that you remember might not be the things that you actually want to draw attention to, like as in like things that like went wrong, like especially if a lot of it's going right. But I really recommend you take notes and check in throughout the event. And then, I mean, all you can do at the point of an event starting is let it flow, let it go a little bit at least, and put out fires as they come up. Would be my best advice, is just like stay on top of it, trust your team, put people you trust in the positions that you need them to be most reliable for, and then hopefully things go smoothly. Section 3 is after an event is hosted, things you can do to make the hosting of that event more accessible. The big thing that I think people often forget is once an event is finished, you are not off the hook completely as an organizer of an event. Like there are still some really valuable things that you can do to assure that an event that runs annually, or an event that you might be running again in a similar capacity, has the best information it can in terms of how to be improved. And the best way to do this, as I mentioned before, is to ask, get feedback. It's really important to give attendees and to give staff the ability to provide anonymous feedback on an event after it's occurred. This can be done through a survey platform similar to the one sent out prior to an event to ask for accessibility accommodations. And you can format it in similar ways depending on the feedback that you're looking for. But I would just essentially offer long answer responses, assure them that it is anonymous, and let them know that we want to hear their feedback for things that worked and things especially that didn't work. The next part is not only taking in the feedback, but using the feedback. If you get someone telling you that you completely forgot an accommodation that you said you would do, or that you said you wanted to have, or whatever else, like think about that. Like think about how that can be improved for next time. And the best way to do this, I think, is like assuring a sense of what I call, or what is called, institutional memory. So yeah, when you're running an event, you want to make sure that the messages passed down to you of things that worked and things that didn't work get passed on through your organization and through your role. A lot of us only are in a role for a school year, sometimes less, and there might be other members of an organization that host similar events and want guidelines. This can often be done through exit reports, through planning guides. You can do presentations, you can do trainings, you can pass on notes to members of your team. There's a wide range of ways to do it, but like essentially find a way that the information that you learned from hosting an event is going to be passed down. And that way you're assuring that events from your organization only really get better over time. So this process can really assure that those who run the events, as I said, even after you leave your position, utilize what you have learned, what went well, what went badly, and then things just get better over time, as it should be. Like without this institutional memory, you just make the same mistakes over and over again. And we want to avoid that in every way we can. Section 4, final section, is about online events. There is so much to go over in terms of accessibility for online events, and it doesn't really easily break down along set areas. Like there's so many little things that you often forget to do, or like that need to be considered, that like often might be just like not second nature to do, because obviously in the in-person context, a lot of these things don't come up. But I've had a little list that I made of like things to consider that you maybe wouldn't automatically consider in terms of online event accessibility. The first thing is closed captioning on Zoom. I say Zoom, but I mean this can happen on Microsoft Teams as well, or like other online platforms. But there is a setting that you can use to do live closed captioning on Zoom, and I really recommend that people do use it. It can be really accommodating, even if you've not had a specific request for someone asking for closed captioning. It can just make things easier to understand for people maybe like English as a second language, people who maybe just like to read things. I know when I watch Netflix, I can like barely hear anything, and I need to have the captions up to understand what's happening. Another thing that I put forward for things to consider would be promoting pronoun use if attendees or staff are comfortable, but you should really never require pronoun use. I know that I've seen a few like things about people being like, they think they're being woke and aware by requiring pronouns next to your name, but in reality, for some individuals, like the option to either like to come out like that publicly versus like be misgendered is like not comfortable for them. So promote it, ask staff if they're comfortable to do it, because I mean like if staff are comfortable and they do pronouns next to their name, it often encourages attendees to do so. You can also make a little announcement at the start of your event being like, we want to point out that we really promote and like are open to people putting their pronouns next to their name if they feel comfortable. You can just like remind people that like it's a cool thing to do, and like it can really like take attention away from people who maybe like are scared to put pronouns up. So that can be positive. Another thing is to make sure that the service you're using to host virtual events is compatible with assistive technology. This would include things like screen readers. Most virtual event platforms are, but you should ask the individual in charge of the event or who's running the event in the online platform if they are compatible. I know Zoom is and Microsoft Teams are, but if you are hosting in a broader range of platforms, you should ask these kind of things. Another thing to consider is putting speaking rules in place. For example, make it very clear from the very start of an event how someone can add themselves to the agenda or how someone can ask questions. That way it just like makes it easier for people who want to say things to not feel like they're going out of their way, burdening people, or not asking in the right way for how to like start things or start conversations. And so setting down those kind of rules can just create a nice little bit of like rigidity to like what I need to do, and this is like making sure I'm doing things the right way. Just ease some anxiety, essentially. Another thing to do is, like, generally we ask that you do not require cameras or mics to be on during an event. Of course, you can encourage it, ask people to speak up if they feel comfortable, but I mean, there should be no shaming of people who maybe don't feel comfortable putting their camera or mic on. Obviously, we don't know everyone's context, so just things to consider. That is essentially my whole presentation. What time is it? Okay, actually that's pretty good for timing. Good job. If people have questions, you can always contact me. I'm Sal. I'm the SNU Accessibility Commissioner, as I mentioned. You can access my email box at accessibility@snu.ca. Please do come and ask me questions and we can chat about it. I'm always open to little consultations. And I'm glad that people came and listened to this presentation and are trying to host more accessible events for the McGill student body. Let me try to get out of this. Escape. Perfect. Stop share. Awesome. Well, thank you again, everyone, for attending. Really appreciate it. And please do come to me if you have questions. Awesome. Thank you.